Paul, thanks for being with us. One of the most common questions I have with young men, students, anybody in general, is on how they can fight sexual temptation. What would be your biblical input on how we can fight temptation that seems to wage war against us?
Well, fighting is correct terminology, but we really need to understand it biblically. Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 2, now flee youthful lust. So I'm not going out looking for a fight. Following what we see throughout the book of Proverbs, I am going to fear sin. In Genesis, sin is waiting at the door. Its desire is to have you. I'm going to fear sin. So the first thing I'm going to do is avoid those things that are most likely to trip me up, whether it be media or proximity to another person that may offer temptation. So you want to say, first of all, I don't trust myself. And so I'm not going to put myself in situations that make me more vulnerable. So that's the first thing, flee youthful lust. The other thing is something that it amazes me that people don't talk about this. You know, James chapter 1 is the big book on temptation, or the big chapter on temptation. But right after he talks about temptation, people think that automatically he changes to another subject, because he says, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. And I don't separate that from temptation. Why? Because I believe that the greatest motivation for avoiding temptation and fighting temptation is this: everything that the world, everything that the devil can offer me is a counterfeit that eventually will become like gravel in my gut. A young man, let's say, he desires a relationship with a young woman. He desires intimacy. That's normal. That's biblical. But he's tempted to go about it the wrong way. What he needs to realize is, hold it. If I go about it this way, it will not turn out to be a good and perfect gift. Also, I need to look back at all the kindnesses of God, and also my faith in what God is going to provide. I can take the counterfeit now, or I can wait for the better, which God offers. And that's a tremendous motivation that is oftentimes overlooked. So we need to flee those things and those circumstances that put us in almost a you can't do anything but fail situation. Get away from that, but also look at the goodness of God. Realize that in his sovereignty and his omniscience, he knows that many of our desires that can be perverted are actual in themselves good desires, and he has a plan for them.
Can you talk just briefly on the extent of what Paul is including when he says make no provision for the flesh? You said media, other things that might cause us to be tempted. Talk about the radical nature of no provision.
Right. First of all, we need to be careful about that. Why? Because some people say, okay, I'll make no provision for the flesh, and that's true. But none of this works unless, as a life discipline, first of all, we must be regenerate. We must be Christians. You know, you can fight sin. I know lost people who fight sin, and they're not very successful. Secondly, even as a Christian, the foundational thing is renewing my mind in the Word of God, that I might know what the will of God is, Romans 12, 1 and 2. So in that's the foundation. Now, this thing of making no provision of the flesh for the flesh is not just media, computers, being with someone that I'm attracted to in a certain circumstance that make both of us vulnerable, but it's also, and I find this to be one of the most important things, it's that bad company corrupts good morals. When I was in college, people said, that I grew really fast. And there was a reason for it. It wasn't that I was special. God surrounded me with other college students that were godly. I was in a church where righteousness was preached. And so a lot of times you're making a provision for the flesh by hanging out with people that really do not take sin very seriously, especially immorality. One of the things I always go to is that Christianity is not a lone wolf religion. If I am surrounded by godly men, or someone surrounded by godly women, a young lady, that's what we have to have.
So if someone comes up to you, Paul, and says, I'm fighting my sin, I'm fleeing temptation, and I know I need to renew my mind, how can I do that? How can my mind be renewed?
You know, when it talks about renewing your mind in Romans 12, it doesn't say renewing your mind with the word. I mean, it's not in there. But we do know from other passages, Psalms, and throughout the Bible, that the greatest way in which we renew our mind is with truth, and the only infallible truth is the Bible. But it's also talking about renewing our mind in fellowship, conversation, Colossians 3:16, 17, renewing our mind with the music that we listen to. The Reformation was advanced through the hymns they were singing. And so that's the way we do it. That's the way we do it.
So helpful. Thank you so much.
But let me also say this. So how do I study the Bible? And yes, there are a lot of ways, but I find that very few people have ever read Matthew to Revelation. I find that there are even fewer people who've read Genesis to Revelation. Just read the Bible through over and over and over.
Paul, we live in a world of sexual perversion. It's filled with immorality, and sometimes we can begin to be confused that the world invented sex. But what we know biblically is that sex was something that was designed by God. Can you talk to us about God's design for sex and why it's so important that we have a biblical understanding of it?
Yeah. First of all, it was designed by God. And I think that the thing that makes the difference between the wrong view and the right view is, with the right view, sex is not an end in itself. Even the pleasure of sex is not an end in itself. If you remember when Adam and Eve sinned, what happened? They covered themselves. But I believe they didn't merely cover themselves from God. They covered themselves from each other. That's what sin does. It destroys intimacy, okay? So if we're talking about sex just as a physical pleasure with no other goal in mind, well, it's animal, all right? But if sex has a higher purpose, not taking away from the physical delight of sex, but if sex has a higher purpose, and that is to increase my emotional, spiritual intimacy with my wife. There's the goal. And so sex as merely trying to satisfy what we could call animal pleasure becomes then twisted and dark and selfish. But when sex is designed to take a man and a woman and make them more one, make them more intimate, make them more giving and receiving, then you see something very, very beautiful. So the end of sex is greater relational intimacy, that the wife and the man emotionally, spiritually become a part of each other, become one. And that's what makes it beautiful. When that is removed, it becomes animal. So I've told even my sons this, because my daughters are still young, but I've warned them that entering into a relationship with a girl that there's not the intention or the commitment to marry, even if they're sharing feelings with one another, they're holding hands, or the farthest they go is to hug one another, they're creating a bond of intimacy. You say, well, it's harmless. Well, not really when you think about it. Why? They're creating a bond of intimacy, and that's what marriage is about. So if they're just kind of boyfriend and girlfriend and they break up, guess what happens? It's kind of like the boy is going to leave part of himself with that girl, and the girl is going to leave part of herself with that boy. And There's intimacy shared that almost can never be removed. And so one of the most important things is that it's not just that we remain chaste physically, but we remain chaste with regard to entering into an intimate relationship with another person. You want to go to that altar, like people always think going to the altar complete, which means physically chaste. But you can have all these emotional relationships with people, and it's as though you're taking them to the altar with you. Do you see?
Yeah. No, Paul, like, even what you're saying, I think there's so many different ways that parents or pastors approach the conversation of sex with students and their own children. Can you talk, just as we close, about communicating the beauty of sex without stoking curiosity in it? Because I think people grow up going, if they're in the church, that's bad, don't talk about it, that's a mommy and a daddy thing. And it becomes something that is so private and curious. Talk about the beauty of it and yet protecting curiosity.
First of all, there is a danger of awaking that. There is a time in a child's life for innocence. They need to be thinking about dolls or Tonka trucks or things like that. And we need to guard that. And each child is different, but when, you're in prayer, you're reading the word, the parent's renewing his mind, it looks like it's time. And with each child, that can be different according to their maturity. Here's what I would suggest. First of all, you need to explain it very, very carefully. Explain it biblically. Put the emphasis on the intimacy, the relationship, the commitment. Show how this is a beautiful thing because of the commitment. And when the commitment and the intimacy isn't there, it's no longer a beautiful thing, it's a wrong thing. But here's what I would really warn about. This is going to happen almost every time I've seen this. The moment you have that conversation, it's after that conversation that you really need to guard your child, because their curiosity is going to be piqued. And that's where you need to have safeguards on the internet and all kinds of things, because the child has just heard this, and so they may type in something because they just want to know more about what it is, and all of a sudden, there you go. They've just been bombarded with things they should never see.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's helpful. It's so important that we understand God's design for sex, and then there's a wisdom and discernment, as you're saying, and how we navigate and approach and protect even our children and people in our ministry.
It's not a question. Even someone who puts all the safeguards down, it's not a question of if they're going to be confronted with something. It's a question of when. And here's the thing that you really want to put out there. It's beautiful because the end goal is intimacy. It's sharing. It's self-giving. Okay? And it's a commitment. And when that commitment's not there, then it turns into something ugly.
And that can only happen, as you're saying, in marriage.
Right.
In marriage.
I told my boys this. I said, should a married man keep himself pure from a relationship with other women? And they said, of course, Dad. And I said, I think my son was 12, and I said, so you're 12. Let's say that, do you think you'll marry a girl 12 years younger than you? And he said, no. I said, what's the average? It's about 5, isn't it? 6, 8, something like that, 3, 2. I said, guess what, son? Your wife is alive right now, somewhere. And you need to remain pure for her, because she's alive somewhere. And you need to pray for her. And you can't guard her physically, but you need to be guarding her in prayer. You need to be lifting her up. I want my young men, I want them interceding for their wives maybe 20 years before they meet them.
Yeah.
And I want them maintaining loyalty to God, but also loyalty to the woman they are going to marry.
So helpful and so clear. Thank you, Paul.
And they feel noble.
Yeah, in the process.
Yeah, they feel like, yes, I need to do that.
It makes boys men when
Absolutely.
they view sex that way.
Yeah.
It's important.
And commitment and loyalty is what makes any man a man. It's not how big his biceps are, and it's not even if he's tremendously bold. It's loyalty that makes a man a man.